All right, Adam Thierer, why don't you like the term crony capitalism?
Well, the problem with the term crony capitalism is that it's an oxymoron if you think about it, because there's nothing really truly cronyist about real capitalism. Capitalism is about mutually beneficial forms of trade and interactions, voluntary interactions, where no one is receiving a special benefit. You only go into the deal if you think it's a good deal for you with whatever it is, a service, a good, whatever else. But cronyism refers to a very specific type of favoritism that someone gets at the expense of everybody else. And when that happens, that's not real capitalism, and therefore we shouldn't call it crony capitalism.
Okay, I was at a recent committee meeting hearing in New Mexico, and the Republican head of the Economic Development Department said, yes, we want to have a clearer, more simplified tax code, but we don't want to completely eliminate tax breaks for certain companies. We want to target them. What would you say to that?
The problem with that logic is that you're never going to clean up the problem of cronyism if you sit around justifying it all day long, whether it be for tax credits, tax breaks, loan guarantees, subsidies, potential bailouts, whatever it might be. And so yes, I understand the urge by many state and local lawmakers to try to do something to favor interests or industries, to try to attract them and their jobs. But the reality is that all of those activities are inherently cronyist, and they have costs. There is no free lunch. And so every time a company is given that sort of a benefit, we have to document how the public pays for it over the long term.
So I imagine the response would be, New Mexico's a poor state. You know, we don't generate a whole lot of money. We're trying to attract companies. How do we do that if we're a poor state to begin with?
Well, if you're a poor state, the last thing you want to do is to be making risky investments, because then you might be poorer in the future. But in the short term, the best thing that any state can do is to create a tax and regulatory environment where it's conducive to the forms of investment by companies and other organizations over the long haul. That would mean a low, simple tax base and simple rules and regulations, not complex, laboriously complicated types of regulations for small businesses and big businesses to deal with. So that's the way to do it. The problem is that everybody wants to take the opposite approach, which is the easy short-term approach of saying, let's get a company here or an entity here by any means necessary, without thinking through the long-term costs for taxpayers and the rest of the public.
But if all the neighboring states are giving tax breaks to companies, if you're in New Mexico, don't you feel compelled to play that game?
Yeah, some states will feel compelled if their neighboring states are engaging in these games. But of course, again, you have to look around and say, how often has that been a success? I mean, in some cases you can find examples of factories going into some states that do help. But there are also corresponding costs every time they make a deal to bring a new company or an entity to their state. And those long-term costs have to be quantified. So every state has to take a hard look at this and say, is it really worth it in the long term that we're going to expect our kids and future generations to be picking up a tab for the short-term benefit we get today? And I think more often than not, that benefit's just not there, and those costs on our future generations are not worth it.
Another thing in New Mexico, hot topic, film subsidies to bring movies to come to New Mexico. I take it you're not a fan of that.
Everybody wants to be the new Hollywood, obviously, and lure away movie or video game production from California or New York to their state. The problem is that's an enormously risky investment. You want to talk about on the scale or spectrum of risky investments, there can be almost nothing more risky than investments in high technology companies, movie and video game companies. A lot of these companies are fly-by-night operations, and they're stuck with massive debt shortly after they try to create a new product. So I would think this is probably the last place where most state and local governments want to be investing if they're doing that sort of targeted investment or favorable treatment.
And also, I've read Michael Kinsley, who's certainly left of center, who wrote a blistering op-ed piece about a year ago saying this is a beggar thy neighbor operation for all states.
That's right. It's ruinous competition of the worst sort. I mean, obviously, we want to have in our federalist system in America a form of competitive federalism where states really are laboratories of democracy, as the saying goes. But there is a question about when they engage in sort of ruinous forms of competition and are trying to always outbid each other and playing favorites with certain companies or interests in order to get them in their state. Again, what are the long-term costs of that? And at the end of the day, that's not going to help you become a more competitive state if you're bankrupting your state in order to get some short-term benefit.
But then the movie people in Mexico are going to say oil and gas gets all these tax breaks.
And oil and gas shouldn't get these tax breaks. Obviously, again, if we had what Richard Epstein calls simple rules for a complex world, we could get around this problem. We need to have simple rules that basically say, here's how business is done in our state at a very low tax rate and with very limited select regulations.